The Alien Princess and the Human Marriage. Princess Zarathel stood before the towering crystal windows of the royal palace, her violet skin shimmering in the light of 3 moons. Her elegant tentacle-like appendages, which served as hair, swayed with agitation as she faced her mother, Empress Vexandra of the Cytherian Empire. "Mother, why must I marry a human?" Zarathel's voice carried the musical tone typical of her species, but it was sharp with rebellion. "They are primitive creatures who have barely learned to travel between stars. Their lifespans are laughably short, and their technology is thousands of years behind ours." The Empress, a magnificent being whose presence commanded respect across 100 star systems, regarded her daughter with ancient eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. Her own appendages, now silver with age and wisdom, moved in patterns that indicated deep thought. "My daughter, you speak from ignorance," Vexandra said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "The humans may seem primitive to you, but there is something about them that even we, with all our advanced knowledge, do not fully understand." Zarathel turned away from the window, her 4 arms crossing in a gesture of defiance that was universal among her people. What could these short-lived creatures possibly offer our empire? They live for barely a century, while we exist for millennia. Their ships move like crawling insects compared to our vessels that bend space itself. They still use crude projectile weapons while we have mastered energy manipulation. The Empress moved closer to her daughter, her movements graceful despite her imposing size. "3 cycles ago, when the Vorthak Collective invaded the Outer Rim territories, do you remember what happened?" "Of course," Zarathel replied impatiently. "Our fleets drove them back after a long campaign. What does this have to do with humans?" "You were studying on the academic worlds then, so you did not witness what truly occurred," Vexandra said. "The Vorthak had superior numbers. Their technology matched ours. Our generals calculated a 60% chance of defeat, yet we won, and decisively." Zarathel's curiosity overcame her anger. "How?" "The humans," the Empress said simply. "A small fleet of their vessels joined our forces, not because we asked them to, not because they had anything to gain, but because they said it was the right thing to do. Their captain Sarah Chen told our Admiral Kexvor that they would not stand by and watch innocent beings suffer." The princess scoffed. "One small fleet could not have made such a difference." Vexandra activated a holographic display that filled the room with images of the battle. "Watch, my daughter, and learn." The hologram showed the vast expanse of space filled with warships. The elegant curved vessels of the Cytherian fleet faced off against the dark angular ships of the Vorthak Collective. Between them, looking almost comically small, was a group of human vessels with their bulky utilitarian design. "The battle began according to standard protocol," the Empress explained. "Formation fighting, energy exchanges, tactical maneuvering. Both sides fought with honor and skill. But then something unprecedented happened. The hologram focused on a section where Vorthak ships had broken through the Cytherian lines and were heading toward a civilian evacuation transport. The human vessels, without any apparent coordination or orders, suddenly broke formation. "What are they doing?" Zarathel asked, genuinely puzzled. "They're abandoning tactical formation. That's suicide." "Watch," her mother commanded. The human ships charged directly at the Vorthak breakthrough, their weapons blazing. They were vastly outnumbered, but they fought with a ferocity that seemed to defy logic. When their weapons ran out of energy, they rammed the enemy vessels. When their ships were crippled, the crews transferred to fighter craft and continued attacking. "This is madness," Zarathel whispered. "No logical being would sacrifice themselves so readily for strangers." "And yet," Vexandra pointed to another part of the battlefield, "our own warriors saw this display of what humans call courage and were inspired. They began fighting not just with skill, but with passion. The tide of the battle changed. The hologram showed Cytherian vessels advancing with renewed vigor, their crews apparently infected by the humans' reckless bravery. What had been a tactical retreat became a crushing advance. But why? Zarathel demanded. Why would they throw away their lives for people they had never met? It serves no logical purpose. The Empress smiled, an expression that was both beautiful and slightly terrifying on her alien features. That, my daughter, is exactly why you must marry Prince David Anderson of Earth. I still don't understand, Zarathel protested. You're asking me to bind myself to a being whose very nature is incomprehensible. No, child. I'm asking you to bind our empire to a species that possesses something we have lost in our millennia of logical advancement. Something that makes them far more dangerous than any weapon and far more valuable than any technology. Vexandra moved to another control panel and brought up files filled with data about human conflicts throughout their history. They call it humanity, though that seems an insufficient term. It is their willingness to sacrifice for others, to fight against impossible odds, to never surrender when they believe they are defending something worthwhile. The display showed images of humans throughout their history, soldiers charging into certain death to save their comrades, civilians risking everything to protect strangers, explorers venturing into the unknown not for glory, but for knowledge that might benefit others. Our intelligence reports indicate that every species that has encountered humans in conflict has noted the same thing, the Empress continued. They do not fight like any other species. They do not calculate odds. They do not surrender when logic says they should. And somehow this illogical behavior makes them nearly impossible to defeat. Zarathel studied the images, her scientific mind trying to process what she was seeing. But surely this same irrationality makes them unstable allies. If they cannot be predicted, how can they be trusted? Another misconception, her mother replied. Their unpredictability in battle is matched by their absolute reliability in friendship. Once they give their word, once they consider you an ally, they will die before they betray you. Our psychological experts believe this stems from the same source as their battle fury, their capacity for emotional attachment. The princess was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, she spoke. You believe that by marrying this human prince, I will somehow acquire these traits? No, daughter. I believe that by joining our houses, our children will inherit the best of both species. The logical, long-term thinking of our people, combined with the passionate, protective instincts of humanity. Such offspring would be formidable indeed. Zarathel moved back to the window, gazing out at the stars. And what of love? Our people mate for life, spanning millennia. How can I bind myself to someone whose entire existence will be but a brief moment in my lifetime? For the first time, Vexandra's expression softened completely. My child, that is perhaps the most human question you could ask. They have a saying, it is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Perhaps it is time our people learned to value the intensity of brief connections over the security of eternal ones. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime indicating an incoming transmission. The Empress activated the communication system, and the image of Admiral Kexvor appeared before them. Your Majesty, the Admiral said, his forearms positioned in a formal salute. The human delegation has arrived. Prince David Anderson requests permission to address Princess Zarathel directly. Zarathel felt a strange flutter of nervousness, an emotion she was not accustomed to experiencing. What does he want to say? He wishes to assure you that he understands your reluctance, the Admiral replied, and he wants you to know that he shares it. Apparently, he also questioned this arrangement to his own government. The princess looked at her mother in surprise. He doesn't want this marriage either? The Empress smiled again. Perhaps you two have more in common than you think. Shall we receive them in the great hall?" As they prepared to leave the chamber, Zarathel caught sight of her reflection in the crystal window. For the first time in her life, she wondered what she looked like through alien eyes. Would this human prince see her as a monster? Could two such different species ever truly understand each other? "Mother," she said quietly, "what if this fails? What if we are too different?" "Then we will have learned something valuable about the universe," Vexandra replied. "But I suspect, my daughter, that you will be surprised by how much you and Prince David have in common. After all, you are both questioning an arrangement made by your elders for political reasons. That rebellion, that independence of thought, is something humans particularly value." As they walked through the corridors of the palace toward the Great Hall, Zarathel found herself thinking about the battle footage she had seen. There was something about the way the humans had fought that stirred something deep within her, something she had never felt before. It was as if their courage and sacrifice had awakened a part of her that she didn't know existed. The great hall of the Cytherian palace was a marvel of engineering and artistry, its crystalline walls reaching impossibly high, inlaid with metals from 1,000 worlds. As they entered, Zarathel saw the human delegation for the first time. They were smaller than she had expected, and their skin was a pale color that seemed almost fragile compared to the violet and purple hues of her own people. But there was something in their bearing, in the way they stood, that commanded respect despite their diminutive size. And in the center of the group stood Prince David Anderson, the human she was meant to marry. The Alien Princess and the Human Marriage. Second part. Prince David Anderson stood in the center of the Great Hall, and Zarathel was surprised by her first impression of him. He was tall for a human, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with keen intelligence. His clothing was simple compared to the elaborate garments of her own people, but there was a dignity in his bearing that spoke of confidence rather than arrogance. When their eyes met across the vast chamber, Zarathel felt something she had never experienced before, a moment of connection that transcended species. David inclined his head respectfully, but she could see in his expression the same uncertainty and curiosity that she felt. "Your Imperial Majesty," David said, addressing the Empress in carefully pronounced Cytherian. "Thank you for receiving us with such honor. I come not as a conqueror or supplicant, but as someone seeking understanding." The formal words were correct, but Zarathel was struck by something else entirely: his voice. When humans spoke their own language, it sounded harsh and guttural to Cytherian ears. But this human had taken the time to learn their musical tongue, and while his accent was obvious, the effort was unmistakable. "Prince Anderson," Empress Vexandra replied, "you honor us with your attempt to speak our language. Please feel free to use your own tongue. We have translation devices." David smiled, an expression that Zarathel found surprisingly appealing despite its strangeness. "Thank you, Your Majesty, but I believe that if I'm to understand your people, I should make the effort to communicate in your preferred manner, even if imperfectly." Zarathel found herself stepping forward before she quite realized what she was doing. "You learned our language for this meeting?" "I've been studying it for 6 months, Your Highness," David replied, switching to English so the translation device could render his words more precisely. "Ever since this arrangement was proposed, I figured if I was going to meet the most important person in my future, I should at least try to speak to her properly." "Most important person?" Zarathel asked, genuinely puzzled. "You mean the Empress?" David's expression grew serious. "No, Your Highness, I mean you. In human culture, one's spouse is considered the most important relationship in their life. If we are to be married, then you become my priority above all others, including my own royal duties." The princess felt her tentacle appendages flutter with surprise. In Catherian culture, political marriages were arrangements of convenience. The idea that a marriage partner would be considered more important than one's duties to the empire was revolutionary. "But you barely know me," she said. "How can I be more important than your obligations to your people?" "Because," David said, and there was something in his tone that made the entire hall go quiet. "You will become my people, just as I hope to become part of yours." The Empress gestured toward a smaller chamber adjacent to the Great Hall. "Perhaps the young people would benefit from a private conversation. Admiral Kexvor, please escort Prince David's retinue to the hospitality quarters. The prince and princess may speak freely." As they moved to the smaller chamber, Zarathel found herself studying David more closely. He moved with fluid grace, and she noticed that his eyes never stopped observing. When they passed a piece of Catherian art, he paused to examine it with genuine interest. When a servant bowed to him, he nodded respectfully in return. Once they were alone, the atmosphere changed. Away from the formal protocols, both of them seemed to relax slightly. "I have to ask," Zarathel said, settling onto a crystalline chair that adjusted itself to her form. "Do you want this marriage, or are you as trapped by politics as I am?" David laughed, and the sound was surprisingly pleasant. "Trapped is one way to put it. 3 months ago, my father called me into his office and informed me that the future of human-Catherian relations might depend on my willingness to marry someone I'd never met from a species I knew almost nothing about." "And what did you say?" "I said the same thing you probably said to your mother. Why me? Why this? Why now?" David settled into a chair across from her, and Zarathel noticed that he sat forward, engaged, rather than lounging back. "But then I started learning about your people, and I realized something." "What was that?" "Your empire has existed for over 50,000 years. You've seen civilizations rise and fall, survived wars that would have destroyed younger species, developed technologies that seem like magic to us. And yet, when the Vorthak attacked, you didn't just allow humans to help, you welcomed us as equals." Zarathel considered this. "My mother showed me the battle recordings. Your people fought, differently than we expected." "How so?" "You fought like you had something to lose beyond just territory or resources. You fought like you were protecting family." She paused, studying his face. "Why do humans do that? Why risk everything for strangers?" David was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I think it's because we understand loss. Human lives are short compared to yours. We're lucky if we live a century. So we know how precious life is, how quickly it can be taken away. When we see innocent people in danger, we can't help but imagine it's our own families, our own children." "But that's illogical," Zarathel protested. "Those strangers have no connection to you. Saving them provides no benefit to humanity." "Doesn't it?" David asked. "Every person we save might discover something wonderful, might create something beautiful, might raise children who change the universe for the better. When we save a stranger, we're not just preserving one life, we're preserving all the potential that life represents." Zarathel found herself leaning forward, fascinated despite herself. "You really believe that?" "I've seen it proven. My own grandfather was saved during a war by a soldier who didn't even know his name. That soldier died protecting my grandfather's transport ship. Because of that stranger's sacrifice, my grandfather lived to become a scientist who helped develop faster-than-light communication. His work allowed our species to reach out to yours." The princess sat back, processing this information. "So that unknown soldier's death led to this moment, to us sitting here talking." "Exactly. That's why humans fight so hard for strangers. Because we never know which life we're saving might change everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Zarathel realized that she was beginning to understand something about this strange species. "Is that why you agreed to this marriage? Because it might change everything?" David's expression grew serious. "Partially, but also because I wanted to meet you. The reports I read about Catherian culture described your people as logical, long-lived, highly intelligent. But they also mentioned something else, that Catherians form bonds that last millennia. I wanted to understand what that means. It means that when we choose a mate, it is for life," Zarathel explained. "We don't have casual relationships or temporary attachments. When two Catherians bond, their minds become partially linked. They share thoughts, emotions, even memories to some degree." David's eyes widened. "And you're willing to do that with a human, with someone whose mind is completely alien to yours?" "That's what terrifies me," Zarathel admitted. "What if our minds are too different? What if the bond fails, or worse, what if it drives us both insane?" "There's only one way to find out," David said quietly. "But before we even consider that, I think we need to answer a more basic question. Which is, do we actually like each other?" Zarathel was surprised to find herself laughing, a musical sound that seemed to please David. "You want to know if we're compatible before we worry about the deeper implications?" "Human relationships work best when they're built on friendship first," David explained. "Love, respect, affection. Those things grow from understanding and enjoying each other's company. So yes, I think we should figure out if we can be friends before we worry about being spouses." "Friends," Zarathel repeated the word thoughtfully. "Catherians don't really have friendships the way other species do. We have alliances, partnerships, bonds of various types. But casual, chosen companionship, it's not something we understand well." "Then maybe I can teach you about friendship, and you can teach me about bonding," David suggested. "We have time before any ceremony. Why don't we use it to actually get to know each other?" Over the following days, that's exactly what they did. David asked to be shown around the palace and the surrounding city, and Zarathel found herself volunteering to be his guide. What started as a formal tour became something much more interesting. She discovered that humans were endlessly curious. David asked questions about everything: the architecture, the technology, the social structures, even the food. But his questions weren't superficial. He wanted to understand not just what things were, but why they were that way. In return, he told her about human culture, and Zarathel found herself fascinated by their complexity. Humans, she learned, were not just warriors. They were also artists, philosophers, scientists, and dreamers. They created beauty for its own sake, explored ideas that had no practical application, and formed emotional attachments to everything from pets to abstract concepts. "Your people are walking contradictions," she told him one evening as they sat in the palace gardens watching the 3 moons rise over the crystalline spires. "You're logical enough to master space travel, but emotional enough to cry at stories. You're capable of incredible violence, but also incredible compassion." "Is that bad?" David asked. "It's confusing," Zarathel admitted. "My people value consistency, predictability. We've spent millennia learning to control our emotions, to make decisions based on logic and long-term benefit." "And has that made you happy?" The question caught her off guard. "Happy? Happiness is temporary. Satisfaction, achievement, fulfillment. These are more valuable than momentary happiness." David was quiet for a moment. "But what's the point of achieving anything if it doesn't make you happy? What's the point of a long life if it's not a joyful one?" Zarathel found she didn't have an answer for that. The concept of pursuing happiness as a goal in itself was foreign to her, yet she couldn't deny its appeal. "Can I ask you something personal?" David said. "Of course." "Before this marriage was arranged, were you happy? Not satisfied or fulfilled?" Actually happy? Zarathel thought about her life before meeting David. She had been successful in her studies, respected by her peers, groomed to take on important responsibilities in the empire. By every measure her people used, she had been living an ideal life. But happy? She realized she couldn't remember the last time she had felt genuine joy, the kind she had experienced just that morning when David had laughed at one of her observations about human behavior. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm learning what happiness feels like for the first time." The Alien Princess and the Human Marriage. Third part 3 weeks had passed since David's arrival, and the palace hummed with preparations for the binding ceremony. But Zarathel found herself focusing less on the approaching ritual and more on the remarkable changes happening within herself. She had begun to understand what humans meant when they talked about falling in love. It wasn't the logical evaluation of compatibility that Catherians traditionally used. Instead, it was a gradual recognition that life felt brighter, more meaningful, when David was nearby. This morning, she had awakened with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Today, David had promised to show her something special, a human tradition he wanted to share before their ceremony. She found him in the palace's observation deck, standing before a collection of equipment she didn't recognize. Human technology had a utilitarian appearance that Catherians found aesthetically displeasing, but David had arranged these devices with obvious care. "What is all this?" she asked, her appendages swaying with curiosity. David smiled, that expression that had become so dear to her. "Music equipment. I wanted to share something with you that I think represents the best of what humans can create." "Music?" Zarathel tilted her head. "Catherians have musical traditions, but they are mathematical in nature, precise arrangements of tones designed to achieve specific psychological states." "Human music is different," David explained, adjusting one of the devices. "We don't create music to achieve a goal. We create it to express things that words can't capture, emotions, experiences, dreams." He activated the equipment and sound filled the chamber. But this wasn't like anything Zarathel had ever heard. The melody was complex yet flowing, with layers of harmony that seemed to speak directly to emotions she hadn't known she possessed. "This is a piece called Clair de Lune," David said quietly. "It was composed by a human named Debussy over 300 years ago. He wrote it to capture the feeling of moonlight on water." As the music continued, Zarathel felt something extraordinary happening. The sounds seemed to resonate not just in her auditory receptors, but throughout her entire being. She could almost see the moonlight Debussy had imagined, could feel the gentle movement of water. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "How can organized sound create such feelings?" "That's the mystery of human creativity," David replied. "We don't fully understand it ourselves, but somehow when we arrange sounds or colors or words in certain ways, we can share our inner experiences with others." The music swelled and then softened, carrying Zarathel through emotional landscapes she had never explored. When it finally ended, she found herself changed in a way she couldn't explain. "David," she said, and her voice was different, warmer, more vulnerable than it had ever been. "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I was wrong about humans. All this time I thought your short lives made you less significant than my people. But I understand now. It's your mortality that makes you so precious. Because you have so little time, you pour your entire souls into everything you create, every relationship you form, every moment you experience." David moved closer to her, and she could see the depth of feeling in his eyes. "And I was wrong about Catherians. I thought your long lives would make you distant, unable to form deep connections. But you don't love less because you live longer. You love more deeply. Because when you choose to care about someone, It's a decision that spans millennia. They stood together in the chamber, two beings from different worlds, different evolutionary paths, different ways of understanding existence. Yet in that moment, their differences seemed less important than their growing connection. "There's something I need to ask you," David said. "The bonding ceremony. I've been reading about it, and I understand that it's irreversible. Once we're bonded, our minds will be partially linked for the rest of our lives. But my life is so much shorter than yours. When I die, what happens to you?" Zarathel had been dreading this question because the answer was painful. When one half of a bonded pair dies, the survivor experiences what we call the Great Silence. Part of their mind simply goes dark. Many Cytherians who lose bonded mates choose to enter permanent stasis rather than live with that emptiness. "Then I can't ask you to go through with this," David said immediately. "I won't condemn you to centuries of suffering for the sake of a few decades of happiness." But Zarathel shook her head, her appendages flowing with a decisiveness that surprised her. "You're thinking like a human, focusing on the loss rather than the gain. But I've learned something from you these past weeks. You said that humans believe it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. But you'll have to live with the consequences far longer than any human would." "Yes, I will. And every day of those consequences, I'll remember what you taught me about joy, about passion, about living fully in each moment. The pain of losing you will be the price I pay for the privilege of loving you." David stared at her, and she could see him struggling with the implications. "You would choose that? Knowing what it will cost you?" "David, 3 weeks ago I didn't know what happiness felt like. I had never heard music that spoke to my soul. I had never felt the rush of anticipation when someone smiled at me. You've given me experiences that my people spend centuries seeking and never finding. Even if I only have them for your lifetime, that's still more than most Cytherians ever have." The human prince was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "In human culture, we have a concept called courage. It's not the absence of fear. It's acting rightly, despite fear. What you're describing is the most courageous thing I've ever heard." "Then you'll go through with the ceremony? If you're brave enough to risk everything for love, how can I be too cowardly to do the same?" 2 days later, the Great Hall was transformed for the bonding ceremony. Representatives from dozens of species had arrived to witness this unprecedented union. The hall glowed with the light of crystal formations that had been growing for thousands of years, each one attuned to resonate with Cytherian neural patterns. Zarathel stood at the center of the hall, wearing the traditional bonding robes that had been in her family for millennia. The fabric shimmered with embedded crystals that would help facilitate the mental connection she and David were about to share. David stood beside her, and she could feel his nervous energy. He wore robes adapted for human physiology, but designed to match the ceremonial requirements. In his hand, he carried a small device, a neural interface that human scientists had developed specifically for this ceremony. Empress Vexandra raised her voice to address the gathering. "We are here to witness something that has never occurred in the history of either of our species, the bonding of minds across the void between worlds. This union represents more than politics or alliance. It represents the possibility that understanding can bridge any gap, that love can transcend any difference." The ceremony began with traditional Cytherian chants, musical arrangements that prepared the mind for the bonding process. But then David did something unexpected. He activated his own equipment, and human music began to blend with the ancient Cytherian melodies. The effect was extraordinary. The two musical traditions, so different in their origins and purposes, somehow complemented each other perfectly. The mathematical precision of Cytherian composition provided structure for the emotional expressiveness of human music, while the human melodies gave warmth and feeling to the Cytherean mathematical patterns. As the music continued, Zarathel felt her mind beginning to open, preparing for the neural link that would bind her to David forever. But instead of the careful, controlled process she had expected, something wild and beautiful was happening. David's mind, so different from any Cytherean consciousness, was like a brilliant flame next to her own steady light. Where her thoughts were organized and logical, his were chaotic but incredibly creative. Where her emotions were deep but controlled, his were intense and immediate. But as their minds touched, she realized that these differences weren't obstacles. They were complementary strengths. Her stability could provide an anchor for his intensity, while his passion could bring life to her logic. The bonding process continued, and Zarathel felt her consciousness expanding. Through David's mind, she experienced human concepts that had no Cytherean equivalent. Hope as a daily practice rather than a logical assessment, love as an active choice rather than a biological imperative, courage as a decision to act despite uncertainty. Through her mind, David experienced the vast patience of her species, the ability to think in terms of millennia rather than moments, the peace that came from understanding one's place in the cosmos. But something even more remarkable was happening. Other minds were joining the link, not fully, but touching the edges of their connection. Cythereans in the hall were feeling echoes of human emotion, while the human delegates were experiencing glimpses of Cytherean logic and perspective. When the ceremony ended, the hall was silent for a long moment. Then Empress Vexandra spoke, her voice filled with wonder. "I have lived for over 4,000 years, and I have never felt anything like what just occurred. Through your bond, we all experienced a glimpse of what our species might become if we truly learned from each other." In the months that followed, the marriage of Zarathel and David became more than a symbol. It became a catalyst for unprecedented cooperation between their species. Human creativity and emotional intelligence combined with Cytherean logic and technological advancement produced innovations that neither species could have achieved alone. Art forms emerged that spoke to beings across species lines. Scientific discoveries accelerated as human intuition guided Cytherean methodical research. Military tactics evolved as Cytherean strategic thinking incorporated human adaptability. But for Zarathel and David, the greatest discovery was personal. They learned that love wasn't diminished by difference, it was enriched by it. Every day brought new understanding as they shared perspectives that spanned species, cultures, and ways of experiencing reality. Standing together on the observation deck one evening, watching the stars that now seemed less like distant points of light and more like destinations waiting to be explored, David voiced what they had both come to understand. "When your mother asked you why you must marry a human, I think she already knew the answer. It wasn't about politics or alliances. It was about the possibility that two very different people might discover something beautiful together." Zarathel, her mind now permanently linked to his, felt his thoughts as clearly as her own. And what we discovered is that difference isn't a barrier to love, it's the foundation of it. We don't love in spite of who we are, but because of who we are. They stood together under the alien stars, two beings who had found in each other not just love, but a new way of being. Their children would inherit not just the genetic legacy of two species, but the emotional legacy of two people who had chosen to see difference as an opportunity rather than an obstacle. And in the years that followed, as their story spread across the galaxy, it became more than just a tale of romance. It became proof that the universe was vast enough to hold infinite forms of love, understanding, and connection. It demonstrated that humanity's greatest gift was not their technology or their courage in battle, but their ability to see potential where others saw only problems. The alien princess had asked her mother why she must marry a human. The answer, discovered through love and patience and the courage to be vulnerable, was simple, because sometimes the most beautiful things in the universe can only be created when very different forces come together to make something entirely new.